Podcast 3. This focuses in on the silent dictatorship. Okay, so in the previous podcast we looked at the early years, 1914, 1915 through into 1916. We pick up the story now really in early to mid 1916 with the emergence of the military, the German military leaders who increasingly began to take over the political life of the nation to an extent that we can really call Germany a military dictatorship by 1916, and certainly in the last 2 years of the war. Okay, so the key learning points: what was the silent dictatorship? The reasons why the OHL is the military high command, and the conservatives. Remember, conservatives are the Prussian Junkers, the senior army generals, the industrial elites. Why were they hostile to the Chancellor, and the reasons why they were able to erode Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg, and what was the mistake that led to his demise, effectively where he was forced to resign in 1917. William Carr is excellent on this. You need to read 8 pages, pages 222 to 227. Start off with the pages in Leighton, from which the notes are taken. Read Leighton first and then go to William Carr to develop your knowledge and understanding of this topic. Okay, so August 1916, it was actually the 29th of August 1916 a key decision was made. Now, by way of brief background on this, just remember the Bismarckian Constitution. Okay, the Bismarckian Constitution was very, very clear. The pillar of the German political life was the Emperor and the Chancellor. Okay, and the Chancellor was accountable to the Emperor, not to the Reichstag. And therefore it was the backing that the Emperor gave to the Chancellor that effectively made the Chancellor so powerful in Germany, but the Chancellor needed the backing of the Emperor. Now, we've already seen, and we saw this in the previous lesson, that necessarily the German military, the army, had to be given control over the economy during World War I. Necessarily so, because they quickly realised to win World War I, you've got to mobilise the whole nation. And so, as we saw in the previous lesson, the War Ministry, for example, controlled labour. Okay, for example, it controlled the War Materials Department. Do you remember the KRA? So, right from the beginning of World War I, 1914, the German military did expand its power. But the expansion of its power was only over the economy, not over politics. Now that really began to change, certainly in 1916. What we start to see is the military expanding its power into the political life of the nation. Okay, now the main reason it was able to do with this goes back to the point I said a minute ago. The Chancellor was, according to the Bismarckian Constitution, the Chancellor controlled politics. The Chancellor was Bethmann-Hollweg, but the Chancellor, his position was dependent on the support of the Emperor. The Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was weak, particularly in World War I. The first 2 years of World War I, the Kaiser increasingly disappeared. He lost confidence, he retreated to his estate, and so therefore Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg was unprotected. Now, what happened here in August 1916, the 29th of August, Bethmann made a tactical blunder, huge political blunder. Okay, he sacked Falkenhayn. Now, Falkenhayn was the leader of the military high command. Falkenhayn was the guy who basically was behind the Verdun, which we've already said was a horribly unpopular military offensive. And so what Bethmann did is he basically sacked Falkenhayn and he replaced him with Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Now, Hindenburg and Ludendorff were the military generals who had fought the war against Russia in the east, and they were hugely popular. They were war heroes. Remember, the war against Russia went very, very well in the first year. The Battle of Tannenberg, the Battle of Missouri and Lakes. So what Bethmann was trying to do here by sacking Falkenhayn and making Hindenburg and Ludendorff the leaders of the OHL was to shore up his own declining political position by winning popular support for himself, because these two generals were hugely popular with the ordinary people. So as the war began to go wrong, and as the ordinary people of Germany began to turn against the war to try to boost his own popularity, what Bethmann-Hollweg did was appoint these two military leaders, brought them back from the front basically, and made them commanders of the OHL. But that backfired. They were so popular that they used that popularity by threatening resignation unless Bethmann-Hollweg ran the country the way they wanted him to run the country. So basically Bethmann-Hollweg trapped himself. He was forced to effectively do what Hindenburg and Ludendorff wanted him to do, and because Bethmann-Hollweg did not have the backing of the Kaiser, or the Kaiser was not there to protect him, Bethmann-Hollweg increasingly became the puppet of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who were therefore really the silent dictators. So from this point on, there was a silent dictatorship, and you can see that in so many ways. Increasingly, the members of the state secretaries, the members of the imperial cabinet, they were the choice of Hindenburg and Ludendorff rather than the choice of the Chancellor. 1916, the auxiliary service law was passed, which very much militarised society. Go to William Carr on that, on the auxiliary service law, very, very good. All sorts of measures that were introduced that, for example, mobilised children to do their bit for the war effort, women to do their bit for the war effort, workers' rights were diminished. They could be moved from one part of the country to another. Not as the service law was actually toned down. It wasn't as extreme as Ludendorff wanted it, but nevertheless, we do see the military becoming much more powerful. So it wasn't just the economy being mobilised; it was the whole life of the nation being mobilised to serve the military needs of the nation. Now, the OHL and other conservatives increasingly, though, became hostile to Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg for several reasons. Okay, we're now talking about 1916, 17, 1918. Firstly, Bethmann-Hollweg on two occasions abandoned the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. As we've already said, Hollweg was quite rightly wary of America coming into the war, and so whenever Bethmann-Hollweg abandoned that policy, of course, he made enemies in the German military, in particular in the German Navy. Secondly, they also resented Bethmann's conciliatory approaches to the SPD. Now, Bethmann understandably had to work with the Social Democrats. They were the largest party in the Reichstag, and they represented the largest social group, the workers. Now, by 1916, it was increasingly obvious the war was going badly, and so increasingly the mood was turning against the war. Ordinary people, ordinary German people, in particular the working classes, were increasingly talking about Germany needs to end this war because it is going badly. Bethmann wasn't daft. He realised that he needed to work with the SPD, so he increasingly made overtures in the Reichstag to give the SPD what they wanted. So, for example, he promised to reform Prussia's voting system, which was very much weighted in favour of the upper classes. Now, of course, by giving in to what the SPD wanted, by holding out an olive branch, that upset, it worried, it made the upper classes anxious. When the war ended, they would lose their power and their status. So increasingly, the OHL, particularly Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and all of the elites are now turning against Bethmann-Hollweg. Now, that very much came to the head in March 1917. Well, think about what happened in March 1917. There was a revolution in Russia. the Russian emperor, the Tsar, was overthrown. And that mood started to spread to Germany. Increasingly the working classes are thinking, well, we should be taking advantage of this to push, to end the war in Germany, and so on and so forth. Bethmann-Hollweg therefore allowed the Reichstag to create a special committee to consider the issue of reforming the constitution, giving more power to ordinary people when the war actually ended. Now that, of course, again, get more enemies for Bethmann-Hollweg by even thinking of that, and even though actually the Kaiser approved of that move himself. And then in July 1917, shock horror, the Reichstag openly started talking about peace, that Germany should end that war. And Bethmann-Hollweg, again supported by the Kaiser, actually made overtures to Britain and to France. Now, Britain and France rejected those overtures. They didn't want to sign peace at that particular time, but nevertheless the fact that Bethmann allowed that to happen really was at that stage it was the nail in his coffin. Okay, so as the war progressed, the OHL was able to interfere more and more in political affairs. The influence of Bethmann-Hollweg was eroded. This slide just sums the reasons. First of all, the Kaiser had lost his self-confidence, increasingly a distant figure, and therefore Bethmann-Hollweg lost the only person who could really protect him. So Bethmann-Hollweg was isolated. Secondly, Bethmann and his government did not have support in the Reichstag. Bergfried and the Reichstag existed because of patriotic loyalty. And without the Kaiser's involvement, Bethmann lost his power base. He was now exposed to the encroachments of Hindenburg-Ludendorff and the Prussian elites, who were increasingly keen to get rid of him. So Bethmann was forced out of office in July 1917. The final turning point, once again he opposed the reintroduction of unrestricted submarine warfare. Bethmann-Hollweg resigned. He felt it was the only thing he could do. And the new Chancellor, a Prussian administrator called Michaelis, who was on holiday at the time, he was effectively the choice of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who saw him as a man who they could easily influence. There's a picture of Michaelis there. He was as surprised as anybody to be given the chancellorship. A very, very insignificant person in history. He himself did not last very long either. So that's the story of the silent dictatorship. Do your extra note making, and then go on to the next podcast, which will be about the human experience of war. Thank you.